Chapter 26, Half Moon Bay. Originally from the southwest Texas border town of El Paso, Adelina Floribella de la Cruz came to Los Angeles after graduating fifth in her class at South Texas College of Law. She was a circumspect sort who kept mostly to herself. The popular girls at Coronado High, where she'd excelled in debate competitions, considered her odd. Not because she was an egghead, but because most girls, as pretty as she was, tended to be more socially active. The truth was, she had big tits. But contrary to contemporary standards, she was unconventionally modest. Basically, she wasn't comfortable with the kind of attention she got. She'd rather be acknowledged for her mind rather than her physical attributes. Her mother, Marta, was the mental mold from which Adelina was cast. Though smallish in stature, Marta was a giant on the inside. She was tranquil in demeanor, but emitted a self-assured spirit that served as a natural attraction to others. She'd been a midwife who'd run her own birthing center, catering mostly to women who traveled from Mexico. Back then, patrons arrived daily at the small red brick storefront on Texas Avenue. They got to her doors any way they could. Some came by car, and some crossed the Paso del Norte bridge on foot. Others floated across the Rio Grande on inner tubes. In those days, clients actually did show up on the doorsteps with their clothes still wet. Although the birthing center was only a mile from the U.S. border, it represented eons from life in Mexico. For $700, Marta Maria Ramirez de la Cruz could ensure that the babies born in her clinic would be U.S. citizens. Adelina was an only child, but she didn't fit the spoiled brat stereotype. She'd spent countless hours at the center doing menial tasks without complaint. She took a particular solace in helping to keep order. It was her peculiar way of keeping her emotions in check. Even as a young girl, she'd worried about the clients' futures. It was during these formative years that she learned how the real world worked. There was nothing extraordinary about her family. They were a typical, hard-working, average household. She was a daddy's girl, and her parents were ordinary, responsible people who went to work every day. Saturday play, Sunday church. Then, one day, all that changed. Her father, Mauricio Ramos de la Cruz, was a 6-foot-tall man's man who sported a lean, muscular build. Adelina got her height from him. He was generally an even-tempered man, a straight shooter who always let you know where he stood. Mauricio worked for a wealthy family who counted rental properties among their many holdings. The family had real estate investments locally as well as in nearby Otero County, New Mexico. Mauricio's job was general maintenance. It was a position well suited to his can-do personality. When Mauricio headed north up Highway 54 that morning, his only concern was what he'd have for lunch. He'd made the 25-mile trip to Alamogordo, New Mexico, just outside Holloman Air Force Base, dozens of times. This morning, he was headed to one of the buildings that provided cheap housing for locals and airmen who wanted to live off base. Despite the fact that the building was a consistent moneymaker, the owners never kept this particular investment up to code. Maybe that's what made it profitable, Mauricio thought as he pulled the Chevy pickup into the parking lot. Today, he'd perform his least favorite task. Pulling a large burlap sack from beneath a toolbox, he stared at the insecticides, herbicides, and other pest control products lining the truck bed. There wouldn't be any spraying today. Today, he'd collect the proceeds from the rat traps. If there was anything Mauricio hated, it was rats. He lifted an aluminum baseball bat from the truck bed and started toward the building. The basement was eerily dark even after he'd switched on the overhead light. He'd barely gotten to the bottom of the stairwell when he heard a muffled rustling. He tightened his grip on the bat. Something moved in the corner of his eye, and a woman suddenly shrieked. Before he knew it, a man leapt out of the shadows and lurched at him, Mauricio instinctively swung the bat. It rang with the same metallic clank he'd heard 1,000,000 times as a kid on the playground. It didn't surprise him that the guy went down. It did surprise him that he was naked. Then the woman appeared. She was naked too. It was obvious from the trauma in her eyes that she'd been raped. She clutched a dingy cotton dress against her frail body as she stared at her fallen attacker. All Mauricio could tell about the man on the floor was that he was Mexican and that he was dead. As blood pooled around the guy's head, the woman looked to Mauricio. Their anxious eyes met, and it seemed that forever passed between them before she suddenly bolted up the stairs and disappeared. The cops weren't skeptical of Mauricio's account of events. They believed him when he claimed self-defense. They weren't concerned over the whereabouts of any alleged rape victim. After all, it was just Mexican on Mexican crime. The authorities were ready to tie a bow around the whole thing when the worm took an unexpected turn. The dead guy turned out to be a rogue Border Patrol agent who was moonlighting as a coyote. Further investigation revealed the building was a safe house. Once the property was tied to human trafficking, the owners were determined to shut the investigation down. To eliminate their exposure, they sacrificed Mauricio. Rather than rally to the defense of their longtime employee, they instead used their influence to redirect the investigation. Convicted of murder in the first degree, Mauricio Ramos de la Cruz was sentenced to life in prison. In the years following her father's conviction, Adelina fought tirelessly to clear him, but no one would take the case. Her best hope had been the Innocence Project, but they maintained there was no legal argument to be made. In order to prove Mauricio's innocence, they'd have to prove massive conspiracy on the part of both state and county officials. Initially, Adelina had hoped to find a job in the Department of Justice. Naivete bolstered her hopes that haunting the halls of fair play would somehow yield a champion who would advocate for her cause. In short order, she was broke, defeated, and ready to go home. That's when Providence intervened. Through an unlikely series of events, the doors of the Federal Bureau of Prisons sprung open to her. Although grateful for the job, she viewed the Bureau as merely an avenue to gaining freedom for her dad. Her dream scenario was to get him a new trial. At the very least, she hoped for a sentence reduction. In the meantime, she'd work to improve prison conditions. At least, that had been the plan. But today, Adelina's concerns went beyond Mauricio. At the oddest times, she'd found herself uncomfortably invested in this man she called Jesse in the solitude of her mind. Recently, she'd noticed a definite change in his behavior. Instead of his usually upbeat self, he'd become subdued and standoffish. He brooded over muffled phone calls and disappeared for hours into the segregation pods. He hadn't made her privy to his thoughts, but she was acutely aware of his physical comings and goings. Ever since that seminal moment in the office when he'd all but swooned at her feet, he'd been inexplicably avoiding her. If circumstance demanded he talk to her, he'd avert his eyes. She wondered why. Laying in bed, staring at the ceiling, she dwelt on him again. She didn't know what to do with her feelings. Did she want him to be interested in her? Was she interested in him? What if she was? What if he wasn't? It didn't matter. She wasn't going to get involved in an office romance. But other events at the office also stoked her imagination. Lately, she wasn't sure what to make of what she'd been seeing. Communications from military types had been coming in from everywhere. Some were active duty, some were retired. The messages were always short. Major so-and-so says congrats, Captain such-and-such sends his regards. She'd heard it said jokingly that all black people knew each other. By virtue of the notification deluge, it seemed to her that all black military officers actually did. He told her about accepting the adjunct general position as a way of explaining all the contact. Maybe she'd have picked up on things quicker if she hadn't been otherwise preoccupied. Mauricio's health was failing, and she was afraid he wasn't getting the medical attention he needed. The notion that he might actually die in prison terrified her. The last time she'd spoken to him, he'd promised he was fine and changed the subject by asking if she was seeing anybody. She wouldn't have broached the subject of Jesse even if they had been seeing each other. Mauricio wasn't exactly a racist, but he didn't think much of blacks in general. She'd heard his opinions enough to know as much. Mauricio thought blacks were losers. They're always blaming gringos for their problems, he'd say. They don't stick together. They've been in the U.S. for hundreds of years and they still don't make anything of themselves. The few properties he tended that were occupied by blacks were always in poor condition. They weren't only run down, but were carelessly squalid. To Mauricio, blacks had no pride in their surroundings, no sense of personal responsibility. But most of all, he condemned their treatment of women. They think all women are peaches. He summed it up to lack of character. She could already hear him say, "How could you be in love with a mayate?" In love. It was the first time she'd allowed herself to think of it. She'd never been in love before. She'd had phases of infatuation with a couple of boys at school and even a professor or two, but nothing that remotely approached love. This wasn't that. This was different. But lately, it hadn't been easy to be around him. She'd pretended not to notice the tension between them. She knew he felt something for her, but instead of letting her in, he was keeping her out. She didn't have a lot of experience with men, but certainly nobody had ever spurned her. Was his distance partly responsible for her intrigue? There wasn't a lot to do on a Saturday morning in the unincorporated area of Santa Barbara County where she lived. To clear her mind, she decided to take a day trip up the coast. The smell of a salty breeze and the sun on her face would be good for her. Half Moon Bay seemed like just the thing. Years ago, when the coastal community was known as Spanish Town, one of her ancestors had owned property there. The relative had received a small parcel of land from Tiburcio Vasquez after Vasquez's successful bid to win the Mexican land grant of 1839. The parcel eventually ended up in the hands of another relative, one Frank Torres, who built an infamous speakeasy on the property in the 1920s. She'd wanted to go there ever since she first heard the family whispers as a child. Today would be the day. Half Moon Bay was about 300 miles up the coast, approximately a 4-hour drive. If she left now, she could be there by early afternoon. As soon as the overnight bag hit the VW Beetle's back seat, she dropped the top and headed north on California Highway 1. Cruising along the coast, listening to the radio, feeling the wind whipping through her hair, she felt oddly proud of herself. Normally, she wasn't so impulsive. It felt good just to do something without overthinking it. She'd been right about the wind and sun. She hadn't bothered to book a room. She'd find a hotel when she got there. Judging from the town's website, there was sure to be a quaint beachfront inn readily available at walk-in. She leaned back, admiring the contrast of the pillowy white clouds against the cerulean sky. Her mind drifted with them as they floated almost touchable over the sapphire waves. The miles evaporated into the rhythm streaming through the Bluetooth, and before she knew it, the imposing facade of Hearst Castle was emerging in the distance. The closer she got, the more she marveled at the grandeur of Casa Grande's magnificent towers. Hearst had spent considerable time and money modeling the castle's architecture after the Renaissance style of the church at Ronda in southern Spain. He'd be happy to know she approved. What must it be like to have that kind of money, she thought. She knew she'd never know. The landmark slowly faded in a rearview mirror as she got closer to her destination. When she checked into the Harborview Inn, she'd merely wanted to see the room. She hadn't meant to fall asleep. She wondered how long she slept. Moving to the window, she pushed aside the curtains and looked down on the waves lapping gently against the sands below. The hour surprised her. The sun would be setting soon. It seemed like only minutes ago she'd been having lunch at the Miramar Beach restaurant. Like a lot of the buildings in the old coastal town, it had been built in the early 1900s. When she'd commented on its charm, the waitress told her that back in the day, it lured a more salacious crowd. The Ocean Beach Tavern, as it was known in the 1920s, had been designed as a Prohibition roadhouse. One of its custom features was that it was built with revolving kitchen cabinets in order to conceal the alcohol. When Adelina expressed intrigue, the waitress winked and told her about the 10 small rooms upstairs, each with only a bed and a private bathroom. As it turned out, the quaint little town had quite a seedy past. By the 1930s, San Mateo was known as the most corrupt county in California. Back then, bootleggers offloaded Canadian whiskey from ships anchored 12 miles out to sea in international waters. They'd bring the contraband to shore on small boats and drag it up the cliffs. Sometimes, if things got too hinky, they'd bury it right on the beach. From there, it made its way another 20 miles or so up the coast to San Francisco. The area established a strong underground economy based on the trade. In those days, home stills were as commonplace as doormats, and a lot of people earned quick cash selling gasoline and sugar to people looking to make their own coffin varnish. If she was going to be fresh for work on Monday, she needed to be on the road by tomorrow afternoon at the latest. She better see whatever sight she could now. The weather was turning chilly, and she pulled the fine knit royal blue shawl snugly over her shoulders on the way to the car. The top didn't go down at first, but a few frantic taps on the button, and it reluctantly chattered alive. When she parked on the causeway, she found the nearly 400 slips at Pillar Point Harbor filled almost to capacity. The jumble of masts bobbing randomly into the twilight sky looked to Adelina for all the world like giant ornate toothpicks jabbing at the heavens. The beautifully constructed breakwaters kept the harbor unusually tranquil. The placid waters provided a welcome safe haven for fat sea lions lazing on the docks. Strolling between the pleasure cruisers and fishing boats, inhaling the sights and smells of the harbor, she spotted a trawler painted with the words, "Dungeness Crabs." Atop the bluffs in the misty distance, she could make out the outline of the Moss Beach Distillery. The instant she walked through the doors, she felt it. The establishment that Frank Torres built way back in the 1920s still reeked of subterfuge and romance. She spied an empty red leather tufted stool at the end of the bar and wondered if she looked like a wanton woman when she slid onto it. The dinner crowd hadn't arrived yet, and the place wasn't anything like when it buzzed with politicians and Hollywood celebrities. There was no jitterbug merrymakers gyrating to live music, no cigar smoke or vulgar laughter. It was no longer Frank's place, but it still had that air of mystique. She ordered Dungeness crab with a glass of Riesling, and as she waited, she noticed the bartender staring at her. Her first impression was that he was being weird. When she saw him about to approach, she was ready to nip his advance in the bud when he said, "Haven't seen you for a while."
I'm afraid you're mistaken.
The bartender broke into a wide grin. "Just kidding. It's your outfit." The barkeep answered the puzzled expression on her face. "Haven't you heard about our famous Blue Lady Ghost?" Adelina looked down at her clothes. She hadn't intended to wear matching colors. It just happened that way. While serving the wine and crab, the barkeep recounted a tale of star-crossed lovers who had met at the bar years ago. One night, a beautiful young woman had come to the bar in search of an evening of entertainment. During the course of the night, she'd become infatuated with the bar's handsome piano player. Even though she was married, the woman became a fixture at the bar, and soon the pair became an item. Every time she showed up, she'd be dressed all in blue. Over time, their affair became an open secret, and ultimately, her husband found out. Frank's place stood on a cliff above a secluded cove. The cove's tiny beach provided a perfect place to offload illegal booze. It was on this beach, while she was walking with her lover, that the Blue Lady's husband stabbed her to death. To this day, the Blue Lady can still be seen roaming the beach and roadhouse. The shocked expression on Adelina's face coaxed another smile from the bartender. He didn't know it, but at that moment, Adelina believed she'd just seen a ghost of her own. In the mirror above the bar, she'd seen the reflection of a man coming through the doorway. She'd spun around in time to see Jessie and a woman she didn't recognize making their way to a table. Stunned, she waited until their heads were huddled in conversation before slipping out unnoticed.